The fugitive. The night was dark, and the forest was quiet, until the sky split open. A burning object crashed down, slicing through the trees like a meteor. Fire and smoke rose into the air as the wreckage settled. Something had fallen from the sky. Inside the twisted metal, a figure struggled to move. Sparks flew around her as she pushed a heavy panel off her chest. Her breathing was sharp, her muscles weak. The armor on her body was broken, its energy flickering like a dying flame. Her name was Scifi, and she was no ordinary being. She was Nixari, a feared warrior species, and she was running for her life. A desperate escape. Scifi stumbled out of the wreck, her legs shaking. She was injured, but she had no time to rest. Her own kind would be coming for her. They always hunted traitors. She pressed a button on her wrist, trying to activate her suit's cloak mode, but nothing happened. Her armor was completely dead. She was now exposed, vulnerable, weak. Her heart pounded as she looked around. Where was she? This world was different from any she had seen. The air smelled fresh, and the sky was too blue. The trees were tall and silent, watching her like ancient guardians. She could not stay here. She had to move. Ignoring the pain in her ribs, she turned and ran into the darkness. The watchful eyes. Not far from the crash site, Jake Harris sat on his front porch, staring at the night sky. He was just a regular teenager, living in a quiet town, far from anything exciting. He had spent the evening scrolling through his phone, bored as usual. But then, he saw it, a fireball tearing through the sky, crashing somewhere deep in the woods. His heart raced. What was that? A plane? A satellite? Grabbing his flashlight, he jumped off the porch and ran towards the forest. His dad always warned him not to wander alone at night, but this was something he had to see for himself. A dangerous meeting. Scifi ran as fast as her injured body allowed. Her bare feet crushed twigs and leaves beneath her. Every sound made her flinch. She had spent her whole life as a hunter, but tonight she was the prey. Her glowing violet eyes darted through the darkness. She needed to find a place to hide. Somewhere deep, somewhere safe. Then, a sound. She froze. A light flickered through the trees. Footsteps crunched the ground. Her body tensed. Someone was coming. She crouched low, pressing her back against a tree. She could hear breathing. Slow, careful, searching. Then the light landed on her face. Jake gasped. Fear and curiosity. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He expected to see wreckage, maybe even some metal parts. But this was a person. No, not a person. Not human. Her skin was a deep shade of blue-gray, like moonlight on water. Strange tattoos covered her arms and neck, glowing faintly in the darkness. Her violet eyes shimmered like stars, and her hair, black as space, was tangled and wild. She looked, afraid. Are you okay?" Jake whispered, barely able to speak. Scifi didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. He was not attacking her. Slowly, carefully, she raised her hands, the universal sign of surrender. Jake's hands trembled. His instincts screamed run, but he didn't. He looked at her closer. She was hurt. There were burns on her arms, and blood, dark blue and strange, ran down her leg. She was no monster. She was just trying to survive. Jake swallowed hard. What should he do? Before he could decide, a loud whirring sound filled the air. The hunters arrive. Scifi's eyes widened in fear. Jake followed her gaze and saw lights in the sky. Not stars, but machines. A ship. It was sleek, silent, and deadly. Its metal surface reflected the moonlight as it hovered above the trees. Then a voice, cold, sharp, and not human, echoed through the air. "Fugitive detected. Surrender now." Jake felt his chest tighten. What the hell was happening? Scifi grabbed his wrist and shook her head. No, No surrender. The ship's lights grew brighter, scanning the ground. They were looking for her. Jake's heart pounded. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know what she had done. But in that moment, one thing was clear. If he didn't help her, she was going to die. The first contact. The night was no longer silent. The low hum of the hovering ship sent a deep vibration through the air, making the leaves tremble. The powerful searchlights cut through the trees, sweeping across the ground like a predator scanning for prey. Sirvena's breathing quickened. She knew what that ship was. It was a Nixari Hunter-class patrol craft, built for stealth, tracking, and elimination, and it was looking for her. Her violet eyes darted between the shadows, searching for an escape route. She was weak, injured, and without her armor. If they caught her now, it would be over. But she wasn't alone. The human boy was still standing there, his flashlight beam shaking in his hands. Jake Harris. She didn't know his name. She didn't know his language. But she knew his type, a young one, untrained, unpredictable. Not a soldier, not a threat. But was he a danger to her? Would he call for help? Would he hand her over to the Nixari? There was no time to think. She grabbed his wrist. Jake gasped at the sudden contact. Her grip was cold and strong, even in her weakened state, but she wasn't hurting him. She was trying to warn him. Her eyes, glowing and intense, locked onto his. She shook her head, her dark hair falling over her face. Then she pointed at the ship. No, she couldn't speak English, but she didn't need to. Her fear was clear. She was running from them. Jake's heart pounded. What was he supposed to do? He was just a kid from a small town. He had never even left his state, let alone dealt with an actual alien fugitive. But his gut told him one thing. If those guys were the bad guys, then that meant she was the one in danger. And he had a choice: help her, or turn her in. The ship's engines roared louder. A red targeting beam swept across the ground, closing in on their position. Sirvena let go of his wrist and took a step back, preparing to run. But Jake, in that moment, made his decision. "Come on," he whispered sharply. "This way." The chase begins. Jake turned and bolted into the trees, expecting to hear footsteps behind him. For a split second, nothing. Then, a rustle of leaves. She was following him. The forest was dark, and the uneven ground made running dangerous. But Jake had lived here his whole life. He knew these woods. The searchlight passed over them, turning the shadows into flickering shapes. The ship was tracking them. Sirvena, though injured, moved fast. Her breathing was sharp, her legs struggling to keep up, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The ship shifted position, hovering lower, its sleek black hull almost invisible against the night sky. Then, a sharp metallic click. Sirvena's stomach dropped. The hunters were deploying. Jake heard it too. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew it wasn't good. "What the hell is happening?" he hissed, his voice shaking. Sirvena grabbed his arm again, pulling him forward with unexpected strength. They had to move faster. The barn, a temporary refuge. The woods opened up to a clearing, a familiar sight for Jake. His family's barn. It was old, mostly used for storing extra supplies. His dad hadn't kept animals in years, but the place was big and easy to hide in. "Come on in here," Jake whispered, pulling open the heavy wooden door. Sirvena hesitated for half a second before slipping inside. Jake followed, slamming the door shut behind them. Inside, the barn was dark, filled with the smell of old hay and rusted tools. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by their hurried movements. Sirvena collapsed against a wooden beam, her breathing ragged. Her hand clutched her side, where blood still trickled from her wound. Jake stared at her, trying to catch his breath. His mind was racing. What was he doing? He had just helped an alien fugitive, an actual alien. What if his dad found out? What if the government was already on its way? And more importantly, what if those things outside weren't done looking for her? The threat outside. Outside the barn, the whine of the ship's engines grew louder. Jake peeked through a crack in the wooden walls, his stomach twisting. The ship hovered low, its side hatch now open, and from the darkness inside, a figure dropped down. Tall, armored, armed. Jake had no words for what he saw. The figure was like her, blue-gray skin, glowing eyes. But unlike Sirvena, this one was covered head to toe in sleek black armor, unbroken, functional, deadly. A Nixari hunter. The warrior lifted an advanced-looking weapon, scanning the ground. His helmet pulsed with red lights, tracking something. Jake's breath hitched. They weren't safe yet. Sirvena pulled herself up, following his gaze. When she saw the hunter, her expression darkened. She whispered something in her language, her voice like a quiet storm. Jake didn't need a translation. It was a single word. Killers. The hunter took a step forward, his heavy boots crunching the grass. His weapon hummed, charged and ready. Then, he turned toward the barn and started walking. The hunt begins. The barn was dark, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Jake could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Outside, the Nixari hunter stepped closer. His black armor gleamed under the ship's red targeting lights, his movements slow and precise, a predator taking its time before the kill. Jake swallowed hard. This wasn't just some alien soldier. This was a Nixari executioner. And Sirvena was his prey. Nowhere to run. Sirvena pressed her back against the wooden beams, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her wounds had slowed her down, and her body was still weak from the crash. She wasn't ready for a fight. Jake stayed frozen, his mind racing. He had never been in a life-or-death situation before. His biggest worries had been homework and getting grounded, not hiding from alien assassins. Sirvena's glowing violet eyes locked onto his. Her expression was clear. If they find me, I die. If they find you with me, you die too. Jake's stomach twisted. Outside, the hunter's boots crushed the grass. He was close now. Too close. The barn door stood half open, just enough for him to step inside. He paused, scanning the area, his helmet pulsing with red light as he switched through multiple vision modes: infrared, motion detection, energy tracking. Jake felt his chest tighten. What if they had some kind of scanner? Could they see them inside? Then, a mechanical voice echoed from the hunter's helmet. Fugitive detected. Energy trail. Unstable. Suspected injuries. Presumed armed. Execute upon visual confirmation. Jake clenched his fists. They weren't here to take her back. They were here to kill her. A risky distraction. The hunter took a step inside the barn. The wooden floor creaked beneath his weight. Sirvena's grip tightened around the broken piece of metal she had picked up, her only weapon. It wouldn't be enough. Jake's mind raced. Do something. Do something before it's too late. His eyes darted to the side. Near the door, hanging on the wall, was an old rusted shovel, and below it, an old rat trap his dad had left out weeks ago. An idea sparked. It was stupid, reckless, but it was all they had. Slowly, Jake reached out, inch by inch, until his fingers closed around a small wooden crate sitting nearby. Taking a deep breath, he tossed it across the barn. Crash. The crate slammed against the far wall, knocking over some old metal tools. A loud clatter filled the space. Instantly, the hunter spun toward the noise, his weapon rising. Jake didn't wait. He reached up and slammed his hand on the rat trap. Snap. The metal cracked against his fingers. He bit his tongue, fighting back a shout of pain, but the trap did its job. The sound was sharp and sudden, echoing through the barn like a gunshot. The hunter whirled around again, his sensors confused by the sudden movements and noises. And that was their chance. Sirvena didn't hesitate. She grabbed Jake by the arm and ripped him backward, pulling him toward the hidden trapdoor near the back of the barn. Jake had no time to think, only react. They slid into the opening, dropping into the underground crawl space just as the hunter turned back toward them. Trapped underground. The moment they hit the ground, Jake bit his lip to stop from groaning. His hand throbbed from the rat trap, and his heart felt like it was going to explode. Sirvana landed beside him, grimacing as she held her injured side. Above them, the hunter stepped forward. Jake could see his shadow through the wooden gaps in the barn floor above them. The hunter was standing right where they had been mere seconds ago. For a moment, Jake thought they had actually escaped. Then, the hunter's helmet pulsed. Energy signature detected. Close proximity. Switching to ground-penetrating scan. Jake's breath hitched. Oh no. Desperate measures. A high-pitched hum filled the air as the hunter's suit activated a thermal scan. Sirvana's body tensed. They had seconds before he found them. Jake looked around the crawl space. It was small, cramped, filled with old supplies and wooden crates. Dust floated in the air, making it hard to breathe. Then he saw it, an old, rusted heating pipe. An idea hit him. Heat signatures. If he could make the space hotter, it might confuse the hunter's scans. Without thinking, Jake reached forward and twisted the old valve on the pipe. A sharp hiss filled the air. Steam burst from the pipe, filling the crawl space with heat and moisture. The hunter's scan faltered. Error. Signal interference. Jake held his breath. Above them, the hunter paused. Then, he turned away. A long silence filled the barn. Then the hunter spoke into his helmet communicator. Target not present. Possible false reading. Scanning perimeter. And with that, he stepped out of the barn. The ship's engines roared to life, and the searchlights moved away. Jake finally let out the breath he'd been holding. They had done it. For now. The escape plan. Sirvana slowly sat up, pressing a hand to her injury. Her eyes met Jake's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Jake had saved her life. She looked at his injured hand, swollen and red from the trap. Without a word, she took his wrist, pressed her fingers against his skin, and whispered something in her language. A faint glow passed from her fingertips, and the pain in his hand faded. Jake's eyes widened. Did you just? Sirvana raised a finger to her lips. Quiet. She wasn't just thanking him. She was warning him. Because outside, in the distance, the hunter wasn't leaving. Instead, he was calling for reinforcements. And this time, they would tear the entire town apart to find her. Trust and betrayal. The barn was silent now, but the danger had only just begun. Sirvana and Jake sat in the cramped underground crawl space, their bodies tense, listening to the distant hum of the Nixeri patrol ship. Jake's hand still tingled from whatever Sirvana had done to heal it. He stared at her, this alien fugitive who had crash-landed on his planet, running from her own kind. He had helped her. He had hidden her. And now, because of that, he was in danger too. His dad was going to kill him. No, worse. If those alien hunters found her, they'd probably kill all of them. Sirvana's glowing violet eyes flicked toward him. She whispered something in her language, a warning. Jake didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. We need to go. Now. The colonel's return. Before they could move, a new sound made Jake's heart stop. A car. Tires rolled over gravel. An engine rumbled. Jake felt like he had been punched in the gut. His dad was home. Colonel Harris was a retired Air Force officer, strict, disciplined, and had zero patience for nonsense. Jake had seen him handle real weapons, real missions, real war zones. Jake had no idea how his dad was going to react to an alien hiding in their barn. Sirvana must have sensed something was wrong. She tensed, eyes darting toward the sound of the car stopping outside. Then, the barn door creaked open. Jake froze. A shadow stepped inside. Jake. The deep, commanding voice of Colonel Harris cut through the silence like a blade. Jake swallowed hard. He knew one thing for sure. He could not let his dad find Siravena. A split-second decision. Jake looked at Siravena. She needed to hide. But where? The crawl space was too exposed. If his dad walked one step closer, he'd see her. Jake had no choice. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm and pulled her toward the old hay piles in the back corner. She hissed in protest, but he didn't let go. "Just trust me," he whispered urgently. For once, she listened. They crouched behind the hay bales, the thick scent of dried grass filling their noses. Jake pressed his back against the wooden beams, holding his breath. His father's footsteps got louder. Boots crunched against the wooden floor. Jake peeked through the gaps in the hay. His dad stood near the center of the barn, his military eyes scanning everything, his sharp gaze sweeping over every corner, every shadow. Jake knew that look. It was the look of a man who had been trained to spot threats. And right now, Siravena was the threat, the interrogation. "Jake." The colonel's voice was firm. "What the hell are you doing out here?" Jake forced himself to step forward, blocking the colonel's view of the back wall where Siravena was hiding. Nothing." Jake stammered. I heard something outside. Thought maybe it was a coyote." His dad's eyes narrowed. Jake was a terrible liar. The colonel studied him, then slowly turned toward the ground. His boots nudged something, a small drop of dark blue blood. Jake's stomach plummeted. His dad noticed immediately. The colonel crouched down, touched the blood with his fingers, and frowned. He rubbed it between his thumb and forefinger. Then he stood up, his entire stance changing. Serious, alert, dangerous. "Jake," his father's voice was quiet now. Too quiet. "Are you hiding something?" Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. "Tell you what?" "No. I mean, what would I even be hiding?" Colonel Harris stepped forward. Jake instinctively took a step back, and that's when his dad reached for his gun. The standoff. "Jake," his father's voice was sharp. "Move. Now." Jake's chest tightened. If he moved, his dad would see her, and Jake had no idea what would happen next. Siravena must have sensed it too, because at that moment, she moved first. Before the colonel could react, she leaped from the shadows, landing behind Jake. The colonel's instincts kicked in. His gun was up in an instant, aimed directly at her chest. Siravena raised her hands, not to attack, but to surrender. Jake threw himself between them. "Dad, wait." The colonel's grip didn't waver. His sharp military eyes locked onto Siravena, taking in every detail. Her injuries, her unarmed stance, her alien features. "Jake," his father's voice was deadly calm, the voice of a soldier. "Step away." Jake's entire body was shaking. "Dad, she's not a threat," he pleaded. "She's hurt. She's being hunted. If you shoot her, you're no better than the ones chasing her." Colonel Harris didn't answer. His finger was still on the trigger. Siravena, to her credit, did not flinch. Instead, she did something that shocked both of them. She slowly pressed a hand to her own chest and then pointed at Jake. Then, in broken, heavily accented English, she spoke. "He, safe me." Jake's dad blinked. His gun lowered slightly. Jake couldn't breathe. She had spoken English, and she had used her first words to say he saved her. A tense agreement. The colonel's eyes flickered, calculating, analyzing, thinking. Finally, he let out a slow breath. He lowered the gun, but didn't put it away. "Jake," he said, his voice quieter now. "Start talking. Right now." Jake hesitated. Then, taking a deep breath, he told him everything. From the crash, to the hunters, to why he helped her. By the time he finished, his dad looked exhausted. The colonel ran a hand over his face, muttering something under his breath. Then he turned to Sirvena. "They're coming back, aren't they?" he asked her. Sirvena nodded. The colonel exhaled. "Then we need to move." Jake stared. "Wait, you're gonna help us?" The colonel didn't look happy about it, but his battle-hardened expression said everything. "We protect our own." He glanced at Sirvena. "Even if they're not from Earth. Escape or die." The world had never felt this quiet. Outside the barn, the Nixuri patrol ship hovered in the sky like a silent predator, its searchlights sweeping the ground. The hunter who had nearly found them was still somewhere close, hidden in the darkness, waiting, watching. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Jake had never seen his father like this. Colonel Harris was a man who had faced war, had spent years in dangerous missions, had stared death in the face and walked away. But now he stood there, gripping his rifle, staring at an alien fugitive he had just decided to help. Sirvena. Jake had expected his father to turn her in. But instead, he had looked at her, looked at the way she bled, the way she had surrendered, the way she had spoken her first words in English, and something had changed. Now he was making a choice, and Jake had no idea if it was the right one. A plan to escape. Colonel Harris moved fast. Years of military training kicked in as he grabbed his old duffel bag from a nearby shelf, tossing it onto the barn floor. "Jake, pack supplies. Food, water, anything you can grab." Jake hesitated. "Wait, we're running." The colonel shot him a hard look. "If we stay, we die. Move." Jake's heart pounded. He had lived in this small, quiet town his whole life. Now he was being told to run like some kind of criminal. His dad's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Jake, now." Jake jumped into action, grabbing what little supplies he could find. Meanwhile, the colonel turned to Sirvena. "Can you fight?" Sirvena shook her head. She lifted her arm, revealing a deep wound near her ribs. Even with her healing abilities, she was still weak. The colonel cursed under his breath. "Great, that means we're down a fighter." Jake slung the duffel bag over his shoulder. "Where are we going?" His father was already checking his old truck keys. "We have to get to the main road." Then, from outside, a new sound made them freeze. The hunter returns. Metallic footsteps. Slow, heavy, close. The hunter was back. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He peered through a crack in the wooden barn wall. The armored figure stood just outside the barn, scanning the area. His helmet pulsed red as he switched through vision modes. Colonel Harris whispered, "We don't have time." Sirvena clutched the side of the barn wall, her body trembling. She was in pain. Too much pain. Jake clenched his fists. She wouldn't be able to run. And the hunter knew it. The attack begins. The hunter lifted his wrist, his gauntlet humming to life. A blue, glowing pulse flickered around his arm. Jake barely had time to whisper, "What the hell is?" Boom! The entire front of the barn exploded. The wooden doors ripped apart as a shockwave blasted through the air. Jake was thrown backward, his ears ringing. He hit the ground hard, choking on dust and splinters. Colonel Harris rolled away, using his arm to shield his face. His gun was already up. Sirvena gasped in pain, her already injured body hitting the floor. Through the smoke and debris, the hunter stepped inside. His voice was cold, monotone, deadly. "Fugitive located. Eliminate all obstacles." His weapon powered up. Jake barely had time to move. A soldier's instincts. Bang! Colonel Harris fired first. The shotgun blasted through the air, slamming into the hunter's chest. The force knocked him back, but his armor was too strong. He barely staggered. "Run. Now," the colonel barked. Jake grabbed Sirvena's arm and pulled her to her feet. She was dizzy, weak, but she moved. The hunter lunged forward, his gauntlet glowing again, ready to fire another blast. Colonel Harris didn't hesitate. He grabbed a rusty metal tool from the workbench and threw it directly at the hunter's head. The hunter's helmet flickered, his targeting system momentarily scrambled. That was their chance. Go. The great escape. They sprinted toward the truck. Jake threw open the passenger door, practically shoving Scifi inside. The colonel jumped into the driver's seat, twisting the keys. The engine rumbled to life. Behind them, the hunter regained his balance. His helmet pulsed, his gauntlet charged up again. He's gonna shoot, Jake yelled. Not if I do first, the colonel growled. Before the hunter could react, the truck's tires screamed against the gravel as they tore out of the barn, kicking up dust and dirt. The hunter fired. Boom! The blast just missed them, shattering a nearby fence as the truck skidded onto the main road. They were moving, but the ship above them wasn't letting them go. A high-speed chase. Jake turned around in his seat. The Nixari patrol ship had spotted them. Its massive thrusters roared to life as it began to follow. A robotic voice echoed from the ship's speakers. Fugitive escape in progress. Engage pursuit. Colonel Harris slammed the gas. The truck sped down the winding dirt road, bouncing over bumps and potholes. Jake's hands gripped the dashboard as he watched the ship descend lower, its engines glowing with power. They're not letting us go, Jake shouted. They won't have a choice. His father's voice was firm, focused. Wait, what does that mean? The colonel's eyes flicked toward the rearview mirror, calculating something. Then he veered hard to the right. Hang on. The truck suddenly plunged into the forest. The ship's searchlights swept over them, but they were already lost beneath the trees. Jake's head slammed against the seat. Dad, what are you doing? We're gonna crash. But his father's grip on the wheel was steady. I know these woods, he muttered. They don't. Above them, the ship hesitated. The trees were too dense, too unpredictable. The Nixari weren't used to this kind of terrain. Jake saw it immediately. His father was using the forest against them. It was working. The ship couldn't keep up. And as the truck vanished deeper into the woods, the Nixari were forced to halt their chase. For the first time that night, they had escaped. The final stand. The truck rattled and bounced as it tore through the dense forest, branches whipping against the windows. Jake gripped the dashboard tightly, his heart still pounding from the chase. Beside him, Scifi slumped against the seat, her breath shallow. The healing she had done earlier had taken a toll on her already weakened body. The blood on her side had stopped flowing, but she was still too pale, too silent. And behind the wheel, Colonel Harris drove like a man who had been through war. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his gaze sharp, scanning the road ahead. He knew the Nixari wouldn't stop. This wasn't over. Not even close. A temporary refuge. The truck skidded to a stop near an abandoned hunting cabin, deep in the forest. The place had been unused for years, its wooden walls half-rotted, the windows covered in grime. Inside. Now, the colonel ordered, grabbing his shotgun as he stepped out. Jake hurriedly opened the door, helping Scifi out of the truck. She was struggling to walk, her legs barely holding her up. She was running on nothing but willpower. The colonel scanned the sky, his jaw tightening. The Nixari patrol ship wasn't hovering over them anymore, but that didn't mean they were safe. He knew exactly how hunters operated. They won't use the ship in this terrain, the colonel muttered. They'll come on foot. Jake's stomach dropped. What? How do you know? The colonel gave him a hard look. Because it's what I do. Jake felt cold. That meant they had minutes, maybe less. They pushed inside the cabin, kicking the door shut behind them. The inside was dark and musty, the smell of old wood and damp air filling Jake's nose. The place had been abandoned for years, but at least it was shelter. Scifi collapsed onto an old chair, her body trembling. Jake knelt beside her, his voice urgent. Hey, stay with me. You okay? Her violet eyes flickered open, tired but determined. She touched his arm. "Run," she whispered. Jake's throat tightened. Not a chance. The Colonel's plan. The Colonel moved quickly, checking the old wooden cabin windows, looking for possible exits, defenses, and weaknesses. "This place is defensible, but not for long," he said grimly. Jake's mind raced. "What are we gonna do? We can't keep running forever." The Colonel exhaled, his voice low. "We don't need to run." Jake blinked. "Wait. What?" The Colonel turned to Sirvina. "You said they won't stop hunting you." She nodded weakly. "Never." His eyes narrowed. "Then we end this. Here. Tonight." Jake's blood ran cold. "Dad, are you saying we fight?" The hunter's arrival. A deep rumbling noise filled the air. Jake felt it before he heard it. A vibration in the ground, a disturbance in the air. Then, the sound of boots. Heavy, steady, multiple. Jake's chest tightened. They were here. The Nixari hunters were approaching. The Colonel peered through a crack in the wooden boards, gripping his shotgun tighter. 3 of them, he murmured, fully armored. Jake felt sick. 3 of those things. The first one had nearly killed them. And now there were 3. "This isn't a fight we can win," Jake whispered. But the Colonel's face remained hard, unshaken. "I've fought worse." Sirvina struggled to sit up. She looked at Jake, then at his father. "Kill. Leader," she rasped. "Others, fall back." The Colonel nodded. "Makes sense. Their chain of command is tight. If we take out their leader, the others might retreat." Jake wasn't convinced. "And if they don't?" The Colonel's gaze was like steel. "Then we die fighting." Jake felt his stomach drop. This was really happening. The battle begins. A heavy thud sounded against the cabin door. Then another. Jake's pulse skyrocketed. "Dad," he whispered. The Colonel raised his gun. "Get ready." Crack. The door exploded inward, wooden splinters flying in all directions. The first Nixari hunter stepped in. He was taller than the others, his armor marked with red tribal etchings, a sign of rank. His helmet's red visor flickered, scanning the room. Fugitive located. Humans interfering. Terminate. His gauntlet powered up, a glowing pulse building in his palm. Jake froze. Sirvina staggered to her feet, gripping a rusted metal pike she had found. She was too weak for a real fight, but she was still willing to stand. The hunter raised his weapon. Boom. The Colonel fired first. The shotgun blast slammed into the hunter's chest, sending him staggering back. His armor absorbed most of the impact, but he wasn't expecting direct resistance. The second hunter stormed in, but Jake grabbed a rusty wrench from the floor and hurled it at his helmet. It didn't do much damage, but it distracted him, just enough for the Colonel to land another shot. The cabin filled with chaos. The Nixari moved with terrifying speed, their energy weapons flashing, their blades slicing through the air. Sirvina, despite her injuries, fought fiercely, dodging a plasma blast and swinging her metal pipe at one of the hunter's legs. Jake's body moved on pure instinct, dodging, grabbing anything he could use as a weapon. Then, the Nixari leader lunged at the Colonel, his gauntlet charging up for a killing blow. Jake saw it too late. "Dead. Look out!" The Colonel dodged, but not fast enough. The energy blast slammed into his shoulder, sending him crashing into the wall. Jake's world stopped. "Dad!" Sirvina screamed in rage, her body glowing faintly as if something inside her had awoken. She moved faster than before, launching herself at the Nixari leader. Jake didn't have time to think. His father was hurt. The Nixari were winning. If he didn't do something right now, they were dead. So Jake did the craziest, dumbest thing he could think of. He grabbed the hunter's fallen blade and charged, straight at the leader, straight at the one who had hurt his dad. Fight for acceptance. The cabin was falling apart around them. Smoke filled the air. Walls cracked. The wooden beams groaned under the weight of the chaos. The Nixari attackers were relentless, their red glowing visors cutting through the dust and debris. Jake had never been in a real fight before, but right now he wasn't thinking. He wasn't scared anymore. Because his dad was down. Because Scifi was barely standing. Because if he didn't do something right now, they were all going to die. The Nixari leader loomed over his father, his gauntlet glowing as he prepared to deliver the killing strike. Jake gripped the fallen hunter's blade. It was heavier than it looked, its metal humming with an energy he didn't understand. But he didn't need to understand it. He just needed to use it. With everything he had, Jake charged. The human strikes back. The Nixari leader had no time to react. Jake dove forward, swinging the blade with both hands. It slashed across the hunter's chest plate, sending a burst of blue sparks flying into the air. The hunter staggered, caught off guard. His armor had absorbed most of the blow, but Jake had done something no human should have been able to do. He had hurt him. The leader's visor snapped toward him, glowing brighter. "You dare?" the Nixari growled, his voice vibrating through his helmet. Jake's knuckles turned white around the blade handle. He was breathing hard, his whole body on fire from adrenaline. "Yeah," Jake spat. "I dare." The hunter's gauntlet flared, his fist tightening as he lunged. But Scifi moved first, a warrior's true strength. Despite her wounds, despite the pain, Scifi launched herself forward, her body a blur of motion. She twisted midair, grabbing a fallen Nixari rifle, flipping it in her hands like she had trained for this her whole life. Which she had. A plasma blast shot from the weapon, striking the leader in the shoulder. He roared in fury, stumbling back. Jake barely had time to process what was happening before Scifi landed beside him, breathing hard, gripping the rifle. He stared at her. How? She wiped blood from her mouth, then gave him a look that was both proud and determined. "You? Fight well." Before Jake could respond, the walls shook. The Nixari mothership arrives. A deep rumble echoed through the sky. Jake's heart froze as he saw the shadows above them shift. Through the cracks in the ceiling, he saw it. The Nixari mothership. It was massive, stretching across the sky like an iron fortress, its underbelly glowing with rows of red lights. The ship's main speaker boomed, shaking the trees. "Nixari fugitive, your trial is over. Surrender, and your death will be swift." Scifi stiffened. Jake saw it in her eyes. The fear, the understanding. She knew what this meant. Her people had arrived to finish this. The final choice. The Nixari leader recovered, his armor crackling with damaged circuits. He looked up at the ship, then back at Scifi. "You cannot run anymore." Scifi lifted her chin. "I do not run." The leader's helmet tilted. "Then kneel. Accept your fate." Jake's blood boiled. He had fought beside her. He had watched her bleed, watched her struggle, watched her refuse to break. And now they wanted her to surrender. "No, not happening. She's not kneeling to you, freak," Jake shouted. The leader's visor turned toward him. "You dare?" "Yeah, I dare." Again. Scifi's fingers tightened around the rifle. She looked at Jake, then at the colonel, who was finally pushing himself up, bruised but not beaten. She saw it. These humans, they stood with her. They weren't afraid of her. They weren't her enemies. They were her allies. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting alone. And that meant she wasn't losing. The honor duel. Scifi stepped forward. The Nixari leader watched her, waiting. Then she did something that made every single Nixari freeze. She dropped her rifle. Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Wait, what are you doing?" Scifi didn't look at him. She only raised her hands to her sides, standing tall, challenging the leader without words. The leader's body tensed. A low growl rumbled from his chest. An honor duel. Jake blinked. A what now? The colonel exhaled, understanding immediately. She's challenging him to a one-on-one fight. No weapons, just strength. Jake gaped. Are you kidding me? She's injured. She can't. But Suravanna wasn't listening, because the leader had already accepted. The other Nixari stepped back, forming a rough circle around them. It was happening. A fight to decide her fate. The last battle. The leader lunged first. He was bigger, heavier, stronger, but Suravanna was faster. She dodged left, spun, and slammed her fist into his side. He barely flinched. He countered, grabbing her wrist, twisting. She flipped with emotion, breaking free, landing a knee into his ribs. Jake couldn't breathe. Every movement was perfect, a mix of speed, instinct, and skill. But Suravanna was still weak from her wounds. The leader took advantage, landing a brutal hit to her stomach. She gasped, staggering back. Jake clenched his fists. Come on, get up. You can win this. Suravanna wiped the blood from her lips. Then she did something strange. She smiled, because she wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something bigger. For the right to exist. For acceptance. For a home. With a final burst of strength, she dodged the leader's next strike, stepped forward, and slammed her fist into his helmet with everything she had. The impact echoed. The leader stumbled. Then, he fell. Silence. Jake couldn't believe it. She had won. Acceptance. The other Nixari hesitated. Then, as one, they stepped back, lowering their weapons. Jake's breath caught. They weren't going to kill her. The mothership's lights dimmed. Then, the speakers announced, "The fugitive has proven her strength. She is exiled. Do not pursue." And just like that, they left. Jake watched in disbelief as the Nixari retreated, disappearing into the night. Suravanna was free. A new home. As the mothership vanished into the sky, Suravanna turned to Jake. He grinned. So, what now? She exhaled, looking at the stars. Then she looked at him and smiled. She already knew the answer. She was staying with them.